Welcome to Alternate Ending, where we're discovering good movies, one bad movie at a time. Today is the 5th Tuesday of July 2025, and as is always the case, when a month has 5 Tuesdays and we have 5 podcasts, I get to use the last episode as a chance to indulge my own interests, things we don't usually get to talk about on the podcast. And this particular month, I'm going to be talking about something very near and dear to me, which is the confluence of film post-production technology, archiving, and home media releases of movies. And this is inspired by the impending release of a very exciting new restoration, and we'll talk about that restoration in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce my guest for the week. I have with me today Devan Scott, who is not a name listeners to this podcast will probably have heard before, but Devan and I have actually been on many, many podcasts together. I was a recurring guest on his very amazing podcast series from the last couple of years, How Would Lubitsch Do It, which is a deep dive into the complete filmography of Ernst Lubitsch. And we're not, of course, here to talk about that. We're here to talk about other things. But Devan, welcome. Thank you for coming to the show, and thank you for appearing on my turf for a change.
Well, the foot's on the other hand now. I can't wait to see how this goes, even though we're not talking about Lubitsch.
So Devan, can you tell us a little bit, what is your deal? Like, what is your background in film and particularly in kind of the technology of film?
Yeah, I have a very strange career because I kind of float between various elements of what I call, the image formation pipeline. I work as a cinematographer, but more commonly in the commercial world as a colorist, which means I move pixels around. And that kind of lends itself to one of my other obsessions, which is film restoration and reproduction, and especially home video. And one of my entrees to that was actually The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where one of my kind of radicalizing moments was going to the cinema, dragging out my friends to see one of my favorite movies, and realizing that what they were showing was a 35 millimeter print struck from this terrible early 2000s digital master of the film, which had an extra 20 minutes of stuff, a butchered soundtrack, terrible color, and it was all around a disaster of mammoth proportions. And that kind of got me on this bender I've been on for, nearly 20 years. Yeah, wow. Of homebrew restorations, where I like to combine various elements and come up with, something resembling a more accurate version of the film than is available. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is luckily, I think, the greatest success story I have been tangentially related to over these years. It's been, and so these Arrow releases, which is kind of one of the things that we're going to be talking about, represents a sort of culmination of that so far, at least.
Yeah, and I've had the opportunity to see some of your homebrew restorations, and they are very cool. In particular, keeping it within the Lubitsch family, you did a very wonderful and fun retinting of 1 Hour with You, which is a Lubitsch film from the early 30s. Great musical that I'd only seen in black and white, and thanks to you, I got to see a perhaps somewhat speculative but very enjoyable version of that with what might have been the tinting upon its original release.
The funny story is that it's actually probably less speculative than it might seem, because it was based off of a nitrate print that was only ever released on a very old Laserdisc. But that nitrate print is actually an original source. And so despite the fact that the Laserdisc transfer is not very good, I was able to kind of identify which formulas were used and then essentially recreate those. And based on the stills that have been released for the new 4K restoration, which has tinting, and therefore my work is wonderfully obsolete, which I'm so happy about, it looks like we got it right, which I'm very happy about. I can't say the same about the student prints, which I guessed totally wrong in my recent speculative tinting of the student prints in Old Heidelberg. But, you can't win them all. Yeah,
I feel we are currently in a golden age of figuring out what the hell is going on with the student prints, but that's well beyond the scope of what we're here to talk about. I hope that perhaps one day you and I are able to have a conversation about that on the back of maybe a new restoration of that too. But we are here, as you mentioned, to talk about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and generally the trilogy that contains it, the Man with No Name or the Dollars trilogy. It gets called different things by different fans. But we are in the midst right now of Arrow, which if you're familiar with Arrow, it is, or rather if you're not familiar with Arrow, it is the wonderful UK-based home video company. I think, and I'm, just a fan here, I would be tempted to say that they are maybe the world's best home video label at making sure they get it right, both in terms of context of the release, special features and such, but also, like, do we have the best possible video and audio elements? Are we giving the most definitive every permutation of different cuts, every permutation of different sound mixes? I feel like they're one of the handful of companies that I am content to say if they release something, I trust it. And there's not that many home video companies for which that's true. I'm sure you and I will talk about that a little bit. But they are releasing a new edition of each of the films in the Dollars trilogy, which is exciting in all three cases. But I think it's particularly exciting for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which, as you pointed out, has looked terrible for a long time. I would go so far as to say, for me at least, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is kind of one of the canonical why isn't there a good release of this type films? Because it's a masterpiece. Everyone knows it's a masterpiece. It's been canonized as a quintessential work of genre cinema for going on 60 years now. But it has always looked terrible. And I would say the only film, in my mind at least, that can compete in terms of everyone loves this movie, why is it so hard to get a good-looking version, would be Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which tragically Arrow has not gotten their claws on, so we're still waiting for a version of that doesn't look like sweaty butt. But I wonder if you could, because you're closer to this, you've had that experience you mentioned, if you could dig in a little bit with what has been wrong with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to date. And there's been so many things.
The best way to start is to talk about the strange nature of the film's international release, where The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the unusual film where there are two essentially canonical versions. There's the Italian cut, which is 175 minutes and entirely dubbed in Italian. And there is the international cut from 1 year later, 1967, that is 161 minutes and entirely dubbed in English. Again, spaghetti Western, everyone spoke their own language. There's no, you can treat it like a silent film that's been dubbed. There's no canonical language.
Yeah.
And although I would say that the English language version is the one I would lean towards, because you have all the actual the three leads voice themselves.
Generally, whenever I'm watching an Italian film, which anyone who listens to this podcast should know a little bit about Italian film because of me, but they just, for like a 50-year period, they didn't have sync sound. So as Devan said, you just had actors kind of speaking whatever, sometimes not even saying things. Famously, people would just like count to 10 over and over again, and then it would be dubbed over. But I generally have the tiebreaker be, of the three biggest characters, what is the average language spoken between them? And since they often got American or English actors in the leads, that often does mean I tend to prefer the English cut or English dub.
And of course, not only that, we have the difference in length too. It's missing in quotes 14 minutes. And those were cuts supervised by Leone. And in my opinion, and this is me, again, voicing my own aesthetic things, which is not historical. I think the international cut is by far the best cut. I think it's the cut that has the least kind of hiccups tonally. It's the one that has, I think, the best overall pacing. And I think Leone made all the right calls when he chose which scenes to cut. And I think it's a better film. Although we'll get to the scenes they added on top of that for the extended release.
Yeah, and I'm actually not sure. I know that there's an extended release in the Italian cut. I think I've only seen the extended. I don't think I've ever actually seen the Italian cut, so I'm not 100% sure.
There's only one major difference.
Okay.
There's the grotto scene that's in the extended cut.
Okay.
Which is where Tuco recruits his gang, which, you might think that fixes a continuity error, right? Like he just shows up with a gang at one point, but it's a film where, armies appear out of nowhere. It's a film where what the camera doesn't see doesn't exist. Famously, as Ebert put it. And so it's a film that doesn't really need it. And also the scene, frankly, isn't good. Yeah.
And just to confirm, that was not like, in no point did a Leone approved cut include that scene.
He cut it very early.
Okay.
Yeah. And so you have those two kind of versions existing in a stable sense, into the Laserdisc era, where you had the Laserdisc of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Those releases were basically accurate, more or less. Then you had the DVD cut in the late 90s, which it is the film. There are some small changes that those more of a stickler than me like care about aesthetically. I care about them historically, but it's more or less the same movie in terms of like your experience watching it. This all changed in the early 2000s when The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly fell victim to the thing that happens to a lot of very high-profile films where, to quote Jerry Lee Lewis, too much attention drives a man insane. And the film received the royal treatment, a full restoration of the uncut version. We're going to extend it. We're going to use all the material to make the ultimate version of the film. And in doing so, they added all the Italian scenes back. And then they added the grotto scene, right? And so this version is 178 minutes. And so it's by a wide margin the longest version. And what do you do when, those scenes weren't even dubbed in English at the time? Well, you bring back a decrepit, not decrepit, Clint Eastwood is somehow still working with us. So, he was in great shape back then, but you had a very much 35 years older cast.
A older and sounds like it is maybe the generous way of saying decrepit. But I was not going to push back on decrepit either.
Their voices have not aged like the dulcet tones of Neil Young in old age. They have Clint Eastwood sounds, he was in his 70s and he sounds 90. Eli Wallach was in his late 80s and sounds 90. And then the Lee Van Cleef impersonator they brought in, because Lee Van Cleef had, unfortunately passed away at that time. By all accounts, by the way, a very nice man. I like to mention that every time. The impersonator they brought in was, I don't think it's good to bring an impersonator, period, but they did not, I think, play their best card with this impersonator. He sounds a little like, rah, rah, rah. He has this like kind of almost old prospector accent that is nowhere near what Lee Van Cleef was going for in this movie. And in addition, they remixed the audio in not just a 5.1 mix. I mean, the new Arrows have a 5.1 mix, but they're still functionally largely mono films. This is the tacky type of 5.1 mix where they went, oh, we don't have the stems? Okay, replace all the gunshots with very different sounding ones. Whenever anyone's off screen, they pan to the back right channel. I remember you in your review of the film at some point actually said they had done awful, unspeakable things to off-screen speakers, and that's entirely true. They do. For me, the infamous moment is when Clint Eastwood says, $200,000 is a lot of money, and then we're gonna have to earn it. It just panned off to the back left corner because he's off screen, and I guess that's what you do.
Those early days of we have 5.1 audio, which means we have to pan as actors are walking across the screen rather than just no dialogue comes out of the center. That's what dialogue's
every
for.
Every movie wanted to be Master and Commander, I guess.
Exactly.
And so you have that, and in addition, you have a very early 2000s digital intermediate. The visuals weren't great. And so that became the canonical version of the film. And again, it's that curse of films that are too high profile. And so, studios got to go the extra mile to sell it because they really want to make it special. Mm-hmm. And that leads to a lot of bad stuff. I mean, it's the Star Wars thing, right? Star Wars Special Edition is the example of this.
Yeah.
Where, it is still a disaster because they paid too much attention to it. And so since then, you've had a series of home video releases that are in various ways trying to clean up this mess. You had the 2014 MGM Blu-ray, which was a good 4K scan. In fact, it's the same 4K scan as the Arrow discs. Very high quality. And the scan and the color grade were done by L'Immagine Ritrovata, which is a fairly infamous post-production restoration studio. They have a great film festival, and I think in many ways they're a fantastic force for film restoration. That is where you go if you need to get a film restored.
To be very clear, because I don't want to put you in a position, because I know you're professionally involved in this world. I will be happy to say what I think about L'Immagine Ritrovata. But to be very clear, the world is better because that company exists, even though I will be saying some unkind things about that company over the course of this episode.
Let me get ahead of you. The color grade they did for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is like the cartoonish extreme version of things people complain rightfully about their grades, which is that, in the words of, I think this is Jordan Krug I'm quoting here, it's shit green, right? It is a shit green grade. It looks personally, if I were to look at that grade in a vacuum and know it's what the director intended, I actually personally think that grade is not aesthetic anathema to me. I think that, okay, I see why, but it isn't. That's the thing. It isn't what Leone wanted. Either way, even if you think the grade is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I don't think it's that. It is so divorced. There's lots of, we can go later into like all the theories we have about why Ritrovata and Eclair have films that look like that. I have my theories, certainly. It was a disaster. And so 2018, 2019, or is it 2017? It's one of the late 2010s. Kino Lorber, what's the best way I can describe it? That besmirched label in some ways.
I very clearly, not to go on a tangent, when I was in college, and we were all watching art films for the first time, this is in the early 2000s, whenever a art film came to us with Criterion on it, we were like, oh, phew, thank God, because back in those days, less so now, but back in those days, Criterion was another one of those can't do wrong companies. And if it had Kino Lorber, or any of the, like, I think Fox Lorber and Kino were two separate companies at that point, it was always a sign for, like, oh God, because
it's a roll of the dice.
Sometimes it's a roll of the dice. Like, sometimes it would be, like, framed wrong, like it was the correct aspect ratio, but it was, like, up in the top of the frame so they could put the subtitles below it. Weirdness all over the place. So for many years, I saw the name Kino and instinctively shuddered. And they've gotten so much better over the course of, I think, the 2010s, really. I don't even think it's that recent.
They've improved, and they are a label that is that has very low budgets. I mean, they often, to their immense credit, put out films that no one else is willing to put out, right? Like, they put out, like, Three Women, like, they put out various, like, silent Lubitsch films that no one else in North America would touch.
They're kind of the Lubitsch specialists at this point. I have multiple of their silent Lubitsch discs. Yeah.
Exactly. And yet they have always had massive quality control issues. And those issues, like, frankly, come from the top. Those issues come from the top. There is an apathy and a kind of a slapdashness to the way the label is run that I have encountered firsthand. And the first of that is the 2017 release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It was an attempt to, really pushed by the folks at Blu-ray.com and the high definition forum. The users were complaining, and, like, the Kino Lorber people are on those forums and they listen. And the complaint was the Ritrovata version was green and warm. Okay, so let's add blue. But what they added was what appears to be like a blue offset to the image. And so the shadows became bright blue, and everything, the skin tones out the window. In my opinion, it was, one step forward, 5 steps back. It was an abject disaster. It was also the extended cut. That was kind of the release we were all waiting for. And I was at that time in the midst with, my co-director and close friend Willa. We were working on a fan cut of that film, and that release just, like, broke our hearts, and it stalled the project out for at least a year, because we were like, well, what the hell do we do now?
And I feel like that was around the time that I first showed up on your podcast with the two of you, because I remember we talked about it off mic, how distressed we all were by the Kino release.
Exactly. And then so Kino gets another crack at it a few years later, and this is where I come into the story, because I get this phone call late at night from Los Angeles, and I just don't answer it, because of course that's clearly a scam. No one calls me from Los Angeles. I get 10 scam calls a day sometimes. It is, the phones are a useless thing at this point in terms of that. So then I get a text. Hey, in so many words, I need your help. I would like your help fixing The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Kino's releasing a 4K, and that got my attention. And so I ended up becoming involved as a consultant. I looped in Willa and two people who are much more knowledgeable in this particular niche, who are Benji Haran and Jordan Krug. Jordan Krug has an incredible Vimeo channel, and Benji Haran is an absolute hero of preserving this film. And the two of them had scanned in 4K an IB tech print of the film. Now, the scan has some technical, limitations due to the fact that it is a relatively low-budget scan, but it was an incredible resource on that release and on the Arrow releases in terms of a reference. And so, I think the lion's share of credit here, though, has to go to Blake Blassingame, who was the technician of the subcontractor that Kino hired to do this, and the supervisor of all the technical aspects of this release, who basically went way above and beyond what the budget called for in terms of making the release work and looping in people to get it. But it got down to the trenches where oftentimes, like, I found myself at one point like literally internet trolling the guy in charge of this at Kino on Blu-ray.com with anonymous burner accounts when he posted, I shit you not, he posted on Blu-ray.com, which should we release the theatrical cut or the extended cut is the primary one, and like a couple of people were like saying maybe the extended because it's longer, and a few of us just blitzed burner accounts and just spammed theatrical and just like we're absolute jerks about it on the internet. And this is the one time that being a jerk on the internet absolutely paid off, because they ended up releasing the 67 international cut as the primary one.
I remember ghosting around on that exact Blu-ray.com thread when this was all happening, and I'm very amused to think that I probably saw one of your burner accounts, or maybe multiple.
Oh, definitely multiple. It was comical. I mean, it was shameless. I mean, I
you were doing the Lord's work.
Yeah, it's my penance for like stuffing online polls at one point, at multiple points in my life. But yeah, so that release was flawed in the sense that, for example, he was still using the Ritrovata color grade because they didn't have the budget to regrade it from scratch or the access to the log scans. And so they were basically, working backwards from a very flawed grade. They did, I think, as good a work as anyone could reasonably do with it. But I think just as importantly, they included the Laserdisc audio, which was the best representation of the mono. And because they were contractually obligated to deliver a 5:1 mix, they just like stuck the mono in the center channel, did a little LFE crossover, and called it a day, which I think was unambiguously the correct decision. And they also perfectly matched Benji and Jordan's print. And Bob's your uncle. You have the, at the time, definitive release of the film, and it wasn't even close.
Yeah, it was the first time I had purchased the film. This is one of those movies that if you collect home media, you own multiple copies of.
I think I had like 7.
Terminator 2. The first one I had purchased since that 90s MGM UA DVD, which was this non-anamorphic, awful looking thing. But the first time I ever replaced it was the Kino 4K, just because it was the first time that it seemed watchable. Basically, I am very much a if the transfer is not perfect, I'd rather not have it at all. It's sort of my attitude towards owning things on home video, which I'm trying to soften on. But yes, I did pick that one up, and I was very, very impressed by it. I think you can tell, and maybe it's just because I was looking for it, that it was the fixed version of a bad grade. Like, there's a kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I don't have the vocabulary for this, but I do.
Want me to try?
Please.
So there are 3 giveaways that I find. One is shot by shot, the sky changes color a lot in the release.
That's the big one, yeah.
And skin tones are sometimes quite like they're off color, like they're too magenta in one shot and not enough in the other, because it's worth noting that I think a lot of people's conception of like what goes into a Ritrovata grade, for one example, is that like, oh, they just added yellow and green. That's not the case. They use a very complex sets of transforms to do very complex things to the image. This isn't like color grading often involves many layers of work. Mm-hmm. And this was clearly a grade that had that many layers. And so, you can't just rinse that out, and so working backwards from that requires either unlimited amounts of time and money or accepting that some things are going to be inconsistent.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, yeah, it was, I think, a heroic effort, just given what the starting position was. I was terribly happy with it. But was honestly even happier to hear that Arrow was taking another crack at it. So that does bring us to kind of what we're here to talk about, and just to give a little bit more context, depending on when you're listening to this episode, it is potentially late July, potentially early August. Since I know most of the audience for the show is North America based, the frustration is that this is a UK only release, but it is a region free release, so it's playable, but you'll have to spend money. Especially given where we are in sort of the things being shipped across the Atlantic with large price tags slapped upon them phase of our development. At this moment, as the episode goes live, the first 2 films in the trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More, have both come out. They're both available in a limited capacity, so maybe not so available. But Good, the Bad, and the Ugly still is coming out soon. It's an August release at this point. And again, in North America, it's going to be delayed by a little bit because you sort of have to wait for the companies that import these things to sell them to US people to actually get their paws on them, which is what I am currently very patiently doing. I saw and watched Fistful of Dollars, or got and watched Fistful of Dollars and thought it looked amazing. Haven't checked out For a Few Dollars More yet, and of course haven't had an opportunity to check out Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but I'm very, very excited. But so there's this new set that was basically, as with many Arrow releases, the hook was, we're going to get it right. We know that no one's gotten these right yet. And I think the first two films in the trilogy have suffered much less horrible fates than Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, although I think there was obviously room for improvement in both cases.
Pretty like less horrible, but that's like almost like a matter of degrees, right? Where it's like especially like for me, Few Dollars More, just the way, the unavailability of like a good mono audio track on that release has been a huge bugbear, and the color on previous releases has been like, it isn't like Ritrovata, but it's bad in other ways. It has that low contrast, not properly color managed, kind of white balanced thing going on where everything is just rendered absolutely neutral. And I find that very troublesome on releases.
Yeah. And I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole that I want to go down later in terms of why do they look like this? But I will say, since you bring up contrast, I think we are finally, only now that like not the average consumer, the average person who still buys physical media, shall we say, kind of gets what HDR and Dolby Vision mean and gets what like lighting control means. I think we're finally now hitting a point where most releases are expected to have the correct black levels. Because there was a long time where the goal, I think, in designing transfers for home media was just make it bright so it pops. And we had a lot of washed out transfers during that era.
This will be a complaint I have later on, but I think we're unfortunately still in a bright era of home media transfers due to some things with HDR, but we'll get to that later.
Okay. That's probably fair.
But yeah, I can quickly go over the nature of the Arrow releases if you'd like.
Please do.
To
Please
kind of tie it off.
Especially how you got, because you're also involved with the Arrow release of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, correct?
Yes. And Fistful and Few Dollars More.
Okay, I wasn't sure how much you were in with those two, but yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
I'll start from the beginning. And so about a year and a half ago, it was spring of 2024, Willa and I get a very nice message from James White and James Flower, who I've started calling the Jameses at Arrow, asking if we want to be involved in a Leone-related release. And we start immediately speculating, of course, like, what could this be? Is it What's Upon a Time in the West? You know, like, and it turns out it's the Dollars trilogy. And we get, Jordan and Benji are along for the ride too. And so the four of us kind of become the consultant pool for this release for about a year. You know, the Kino release was a course of a month or so. This was a year-long process that, as of, it really only wrapped up about a month ago. When I, a couple months ago, I think, was when I did my last QC pass on the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly's color. I still haven't seen the final color, but I've seen something infinitesimally close to it. And so throughout the past year, we've been basically just doing everything from canvassing for materials, providing our own materials. And also, I've been, for example, the Arrow people will put up like the different sources they've gotten for sound. My kind of unofficial role was to edit together sound comparisons for everyone to listen to go, okay, here's one clip, here's another clip, and here's them all in sequence. Which one do we prefer? And then Matt, the really talented sound engineer, would kind of based his work off of like the collective opinion of all of us and himself. And there was so much back and forth with that. So throughout, we were all kind of helping out, managing everything from the English audio to the Italian audio to kind of, people were sending back and forth materials for the special features. At one point, I believe it was Jordan and Benji did like heroic work going through all these like dailies they had from one of the films to create a long dailies reel. And on one, I forget if it's Fistful or A Few Dollars More. I mean, my brain is mush right now. But anyways, on one of the first two films, there's a very, very nice reel of selected rushes that were painstakingly gone through because there were hours and hours of them to kind of curate them for the most interesting parts. And on my end, I'd say I think the contribution I'm happiest with, that I'm most proud of, is kind of advising on the color of the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in particular, because there was so much kind of informed guesswork that has to go into that, because when you don't have the money to, for example, project a film print that you can't trust anyways against your own digital projection of your version, and you don't have enough money to like commission a modern 4K scan of that print and then color grade that scan to match what the print looks, et cetera, you have to go by what's available. And the best thing available was Jordan and Benji's IB Tech scan. That IB Tech scan has technical shortcomings that aren't germane to the material, as do all scans. And so you have to basically go, okay, using our knowledge of film scans, for example, the first pass of the color was too contrasty because they had matched the kind of slightly blown out highlights and digitally clipped shadows, crushed shadows in that scan, instead of inferring that those were a property of the scan and not the transfer. Again, that's a perfectly understandable thing. But that's kind of what the kind of committee nature of this kind of allowed for, was kind of iteration on it to help improve it. Okay, so other things. We were given, Arrow was given new audio transfers for all the films, and sometimes the audio transfers were still not as good as like the Laserdisc. So the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is still the Laserdisc audio, which is terrific. It has more detail in it than this OSTN and the OSTN and OSTP files that Arrow was given, which were the optical soundtrack negative and positive. So like the source you can get if you don't have the mag tapes or whatever, right? And if anyone knows where those mag tapes are, maybe they're in MGM's vault still. We don't know. And so that was all in play. And then, of course, the best thing was, for me, they could color grade from the log scans, right? And so, you know, the scans exist in three forms. You have the unrestored transfers in log, log being logarithmic color encoding. I did a video on it if anyone's curious about that. The next step is restored log scans, which means that they've done the textural cleanup work, stabilization, that sort of thing. And then there's the color graded ones, which were never used for this release. And so cobbling together multiple audio sources for all of them except the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which was just one all the way through, using sometimes multiple video sources because sometimes a little transition would be on, you know, that sort of thing. And then kind of mastering all those releases was a year-long group effort. Again, I was like, in my opinion, far down the list of people who are most to thank for this. You know, but Arrow and especially Benji and Jordan, I think, did unbelievable work, just being incredibly picky about all of this. And Silver Salt did a great job on the color. Matt did a great job on the sound. And so, you know, whereas the Kino releases, it's kind of like, it was a little bit of a grassroots upstart thing where like one very dedicated person, gets, I think, was kind of working against a slightly broken system. Arrow is, was a whole kind of apparatus working in concert to with a lot more resources to get these films to, I think, a significantly more, again, like an accurate place than unfortunately the heroic work of someone kind of working against the framework they're under can do, even if under the best of circumstances.
Yeah, that's extraordinary to hear. And I mean, certainly, again, I haven't seen the last one of these releases, but I think the results do speak for themselves. I have never been unhappy with anything Arrow has turned out, but the Fistful of Dollars transfer that I looked at and played around with for a little bit was really just extraordinary. Made it feel like I'd never seen the movie before in the best possible way. So not that this is what we do here, but this is a buy with confidence vote from me, at least. And these are movies certainly I expect most of the people listening to this episode have seen or are familiar with, at least. If you haven't seen them, they're masterpieces. You need to. And this feels like it will be the first time that I have properly seen The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Will be when I get that disc in a few weeks' time. And I am very, very excited to see the fruits of all your labor years and the people you've mentioned. And I'm glad to hear that the time and manpower, I mean, a year, that's incredible to just prep. Well, I mean, technically prep 3 releases, but still, that's just an extraordinary amount of time.
And I would also add, they were constantly delayed. They were delayed and delayed and delayed. And that's because, and that is a good thing, that is because everyone involved cared a lot about getting it right rather than pushing out a product. And
Absolutely.
That is so rare to be able to say that about something like this.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I do kind of hover around the the Blu-ray forums, Blu-ray.com, and I know there was some level of disappointment that the releases seemed to be in the offing, but just weren't coming, and I think actually, if I recall correctly, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly actually had a release date announced and then changed. So
yes, and that was again just QC. They just wanted to get it right. They weren't quite getting it to exactly where they wanted, and they were willing to do that. Which again, my hats off. As much as in a perfect world, everything would come out exactly when you want it. It's just they have their priorities.
Yeah, and I mean, people get grouchy about that. And one of the other worlds that I kind of do have my toes in is like video gaming, and people always complain about why isn't the new X game out yet. I've always taken the opinion of like, I'd rather it be right. I'd rather you make me wait a month or a year and have it be right. So that's my own patience as a consumer, I guess. And obviously that's not the world we necessarily live in, but I'm really, really excited to get to dig into this release when the time comes, or so far as I can. I mean, obviously one of the downsides I mentioned, these are UK only releases. That does mean the special features are not, region free. At least they weren't on A Fistful of Dollars. So I assume they won't be on the other two as well, but just the transfers alone are going to be worth it.
It's one of those things where like I am so happy that I have a Blu-ray drive that hooks up to my computer and I can just copy the files.
Nice.
Put it on my
I need
NAS.
to do that.
And
I need to do that.
Yeah, this time it's actually at this point, sidebar, at this point, I think I've ripped my entire collection. So I basically just have them in a cabinet, and then I have a network attached storage that I just play everything off of, which this is so far afield of the topic of this episode, but whatever. Once I'm in a house and I have my place that is mine and I get to make every little corner of it as fussy as I need to, my intention is to go through my entire physical media library and do that. And that will be a year of my life. It's a lovely lifestyle.
I can't even imagine. But so thank you so much for chatting about that release. We're kind of using the release of this. So it's both like I'm excited. I wanted to talk to you about it. I think it's a fun little way to get revved up for this upcoming disc. But also, we're kind of using this as a platform to leap into something that I think you and I both care about very much, which is Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think is a notorious case. As I said, I think to me there are two films specifically, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Terminator 2, that are the ones they can't get right, because those are two big, the kinds of people who buy physical media want those two films. And there's other films as well, but they're kind of notoriously bad because like, how can you constantly fuck up Terminator 2 is sort of, I think, a sentiment. But it's not like this is unusual, right? It's not like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
I know how you can. If you are James Cameron,
you tell James Cameron we have AI tools now, and James Cameron says yes, let's do that, and you end up with a version of True Lies that looks worse than the DVD. God. I bought it.
I think, I mean, if there's, I mean, truly, if there's a single deleterious force in like modern restorations of semi-modern cinema, it's the director is still alive and is a technophile, right? Like this is Peter Jackson, George Lucas, James Cameron, even Wong Kar-wai. I'd actually add him to that pile.
Yeah, we're gonna have some things to say about most, if not all, of those directors as we go forward. Because one thing we did want to talk about is just the way we archive these days and the way we handle old footage and restorations and what home media is doing as part of all this restoration. And, this is something that I care about. I have two hats here. One is the hat of, I have a big old OLED TV and a 4K player, and I want to have things look nice on it. And I care about movies looking the way movies are supposed to look. So there's partially just like I'm a fanboy consumer, but I'm a historian, not professionally anymore, but like I care about this medium. I care about these 100 or 75 or 50-year-old media texts. I want them to be loved. And I feel like you will agree with me if I say that sometimes I don't think they get loved the way that we would like. So I wanted to spend the rest of our time together just kind of kicking around ideas. I know you have some fairly developed thoughts on this, but just like what's going on with you have a phrase here that it gives me a little frisson every time I read it. Particularly disturbing trends in documentary treatment of archival footage. You sent me that in an email about a month ago, and I just kind of reread it sometimes.
So the question is, what is going on? And I think So this gets at, what is restoration, right? What is
Right.
film preservation? I think film preservation is probably a more accurate term I should be using more. And film preservation is, it's a few things. One is you are preserving the actual literal elements, whether they be digital or physical, of the film, to make sure that you have the best possible source going forward, right? It's when I finish a movie that I made, I make sure that I have all the raw files of everything, right? So that way, if I ever need to go back and, export a new version, I have the highest quality source, right? If you're trying to keep a film shot on film alive, well, you keep the negative in a climate controlled space, and make sure it stays there and that space doesn't burn down like certain things. And so, and that's how you get the difference between North by Northwest and every single other Hitchcock VistaVision film, right? Because North by Northwest was in like an MGM vault for decades and it looks amazing. And almost all the rest were in Hitchcock's basement, right? And you see Robert Harris probably lost a few years off his life with vertigo. And so...
I'm always fond of pointing out the reason that we have Charlie Chaplin's work so thoroughly archived and documented in beautiful editions is that Charlie Chaplin bought a salt mine in Nevada to just put his movies in. I think it was in Nevada.
And then he recut them,
I know.
And mastered them in the wrong frame rate. The bastard.
I know.
And then that gets at the other thing, right? Which is the presentation of them. Because it's for one thing for a film to be perfectly preserved, right? Like, I mean, Star Wars is well preserved, right? Like that negative exists. We can use it, but that's the next leg. Can you actually see that? And the answer was Star Wars. And for a while, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was functionally no, right? Then you get the state of, okay, how is it released? So you have so many cases where, and actually I'm going to go back a bit. And so let's talk about the nature of preservation when it comes to exhibition. Most people who know a thing or two about this thing, academics, et cetera, in the field, feel that a film restoration needs to, if it is a good one, accurately represent what the film looked like to audiences at that time, right?
I would agree, yes. People would not, but I would agree.
Exactly. And so you don't just need to scan the negative, color grade it so it's contrasty, and then throw it on a screen. You need to do things like ensure that you have also emulated, if you're doing a digital release, the film print, right? And that's kind of PFE or print film emulation lookup table usually to process the film. And actually, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings because PFEs have gotten a lot more common and they actually like impose a slight look on the film that people go, why is modern color like this? Oftentimes it's not modern color. It's like we're actually getting more accurate colors because what you were seeing in the 90s was a lot of like just data dumped on the screen straight from the negative. And now we're actually thoughtfully, sometimes not. There's a lot of attempts from the good houses to thoughtfully preserve the full image formation flow, which isn't just negative screen. It's negative, inner positive, print screen, right?
Yeah, and I'd also like to just throw a second wrinkle into that, I guess a third or fourth wrinkle into that, from my world, not professionally, but my world of animation. One of the things that a lot of the Disney restorations of their animated films have suffered from is they were painted on cells using certain colors and then filmed on 3-strip Technicolor in many cases. And they painted for the 3-strip Technicolor.
Exactly.
But a lot of these restorations are just like, well, we've got the cell, so let's make the cell look like the cell. And so you get these kind of weird, sometimes very hot colors. And then Disney sometimes, for separate, like they make the editorial decision to juice those colors so they look better on a poorly calibrated TV. But you do have that issue that's only recently, I think, for their 100th anniversary year, I think that was 2023, Disney released very thoughtfully handled 4K scans of Snow White and Cinderella. And that's, I think, really their only two animated films they've treated that well. But
so that's the live action Technicolor too, because
sure,
Technicolor prints had a look, and like I can tell you, the Wizard of Oz digital versions don't look like the Technicolor prints, right? They don't look like them at all. And I'd say probably the majority of Technicolor releases don't accurately represent what the print would have looked like.
I bet. I've never seen a Technicolor print projected with my own eyes. I don't even know where one could if one doesn't live like in LA, but it's always been a dream of mine.
And so what we have here is, so let's talk about just as one example, because I could probably go on for hours about this, so I'll try and limit myself. Say you have a film shot on, Eastman color film stock in like the 50s, and that has been, preserved as a negative, and also maybe as a print or two that that are relatively chemically stable. Prints are fundamentally not chemically stable, but they're relatively stable. And so you need to now translate that to digital, which is a fundamentally different medium. That is, you can emulate the look of film on digital, but that's not digital has no fixed natural state. It's a very slippery medium in a way that film is not. Film is concrete and photochemical. Digital can basically be anything. And so what do you do? And what do you do, for example, if you're trying to create a 4K HDR release of the film? Now, let's think about the traits of film, right? Okay, so if you have a average bulb, your screen is getting at its brightest point around 50 nits, maybe 80 nits if you're a very bright projector, right? Projection on film. Standard dynamic range digital peak is 100 nits, right? That means that's how bright like the brightest pixel is on your screen. HDR, functionally, the brightest point is functionally unlimited, but really on most on like a high-end television might be like 1,000 nits. Right. On a high-end OLED, you're 400, 500 nits. That's still, even on the OLED, like 5 to 8 times as bright as a film print. And so if you have, and you can get way more saturated colors. So if you are doing, say you want to accurately represent what a film print looks like, you're not using 90% of the bandwidth of HDR, right? And so what do companies do? Sony, they go, okay, let's make it look great. Let's make it pop, right? Let's make it pop. I'm going like the show guy voice. And so what you do is, you crank up the peak brightness to like 1,000,000 nits. And so you get stuff like, Spencer, who is very good on this subject, complains about the Maltese Falcon a lot in this case, right? Where it's just incredibly bright at the bright parts. It looks great. Like on an objective level, me looking at it as like a transfer, I'm like, this is great. I'm like Milhouse with like the glasses from Bone Storm. But it doesn't at all represent what the Maltese Falcon actually looked like to any audience up to that point. Right. North by Northwest is another particular bugbear of mine, where like I was like squinting, seeing the specular highlights in Cary Grant's glasses at one point, right? It's because the film was never artistically supposed to look that way. One example, I think probably self-explanatory, that bright means different, but this changes the composition of scenes. You can look at like HDR versions of like Steven Soderbergh films with his super bright practicals. It changes the compositional way of the scene when that lamp behind Brad Pitt is peaking at 800 nits instead of 100, right? And so you have, but here's the other thing. Here's where I put a damper on things are worse than ever, because I think they're kind of better than ever. Right now, we have the ability more than ever to faithfully recreate what a film looks like if we want to. We just have to be disciplined about it. And by we, I mean the studios and everyone who does this, the royal we. But every generation of new technology brings with it new tools to screw it up. And so through misuse. So for example, in the 2000s, you had the epidemic of edge enhancement, also known as sharpening or unsharp masks, digital noise reduction. You had a lot of bad scanners that introduce noise that they'd have to take out later. In the modern era, you have HDR tomfoolery. You have, revisionist color grading. And even the revisionist, I swear this rant will end soon. Even the revisionist color grading part, I think is a bit misguided in terms of the criticism, where I actually don't think that things are any worse than they were like 20 years ago. Because just the nature of the problem has changed. The biggest problem 20 or 30 years ago was you had asleep at the wheel DI operators, digital intermediate operators, just like white balancing the whole film and just calling it a day. So like my favorite example is The Big Lebowski. Every home video version of it was just neutralized. Every scene was just white. In fact, I saw a print of it a few months before the 4K Blu-ray was released, and like the supermarket scene is teal, the bowling alley scenes are all warm, the nighttime scenes are very blue, and that Blu-ray comes out, and suddenly a bunch of people are complaining that it looks different, and they've revised the color grading, but no, it's just for that release. Roger Deakins was there to supervise it against a print and to make sure it looked the way he always intended it, right? And this wasn't him changing his artistic thing. It was him finally applying his original intent that was screened at the time to a digital version. And I got yelled at a lot for that.
I feel like Deakins in particular is someone who has vocally been thoughtful about, you know, some of these things you're talking about, in a way, because he is someone who adopted digital very methodically, I think it would be fair to say, and has a great deal of thoughts about how to use the technology. And I think he's one of the working cinematographers who's best at it, which makes sense because he was one of the working cinematographers who was best at shooting on film. But that Big Lebowski, I'm amazed that people complained about it, because that film for me was always like the Deakins Coen film, where it was like, well, you know, sometimes it's more about the script than about the way it was shot. And then I haven't watched the 4K in full, but I've spot checked it, and it's like, oh no, it's brilliant. It's absolutely on par with anything else he shot for them.
Yeah, that's the thing. If it's not top flight Deakins, it's darn close, right? Yeah. It's an absolutely gorgeous film, and I think the color rhythms of the film are key to that. Absolutely key. Absolutely.
So I'm very much on board with that. And you know, something that you touched on that I want to return to is just it does change the experience of watching these films. The things we've done. When you talked about compositions, it reminded me the first HDR grade I ever watched on my TV right after I got it was Halloween, which, talk about movies that have just an unending, we will all die without the definitive version of Halloween. I don't even think Arrow could make that thing happen. But there's a shot where Michael Myers is holding a knife, and the knife's edge was so sharp and bright in a way I'd never noticed before that it called my attention to it in a way that, in retrospect, I think I realized it didn't, because it wasn't maybe supposed, like, that's not, I mean, that is in a sense what the shot's about, but it's not about having that bright shining edge on it. So it's tricky. It's tough to say. And then the other thing I wanted to pull on just a little bit, and we'll get here. I'm sure we're not done talking about like what happens with color grading, because I think you're completely right. Like, 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, color grades were just lazy and bad. And now we're getting creative with them, and I don't think that's a new development. I think that goes back probably about 10 or 15 years. But filmmakers returning to their own projects and saying, like, I want to tweak this, this, and this. And it's tough for me because I think a lot of times it's vandalism, and we're going to talk. You've already mentioned Wong Kar-wai, so I'll also mention Wong Kar-wai. I have thoughts about what that man did. In that Criterion set.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I also have endless streams of thoughts. So I'll try and stick to one or two, but go first. Weirdly,
no, I want to talk about something else first, because weirdly, the thing that has made this complicated for me, of all movies, Twister, the 1996 disaster movie that's not very good, I decided to buy for some reason when Twisters was coming out. I was like, I don't know, Twisters. It's one of those movies, it's like the line from Chinatown that John Huston delivers, whores, politicians, and old buildings will get more respectable as they get older. It's like Twister I hated in 96, and now it's like, oh, but it's like, it's got adults in it, and they're going through a divorce, and they're having like a real emotional arc. So I bought it and watched it, and there was a very notorious thing that Jan de Bont did, where he regraded the first tornado scene to be much greener than it was in the original. And he always swore up, down, and sideways, this is how we wanted it to be. We couldn't get it right with the tools we had in 96. We were always really unhappy with it. Now I'm happy with it. And part of me always wants to say, well, it doesn't matter if you were unhappy in 96. It was 96. And this is a movie from 96. But at the same time, when I'm watching Twister, I'm like, subjectively, the experience of that scene worked really well for me. And it's weird. It's complicated. Because like the artist is saying it's good, and I'm saying I enjoyed watching it more. But at the same time, I know that it's wrong.
There's multiple spheres here, right? And those things can all be true. I like Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott one, I think is a great example of this, where so you have a few things you can kind of judge these on, because nothing's binary, right? And so let's talk about Blade Runner, the final cut, versus Blade Runner, the director's cut, and Blade Runner, the theatrical cut, the work print, etc. I'll just stick to the first three. In 1982, Ridley Scott was unable to fully complete Blade Runner to what he could have done at the time if he had carte blanche, right? Like we know that film was not finished. You got that freaking shot of the dove and its day, right? You know, in the climax of the film, there's a big continuity error that was clearly temp and was supposed to be fixed, and it wasn't. That sort of thing. And so he goes back and fixes it with his final cut in 2007. Bundled with that final cut, though, is a totally new color grade that, like, I am also convinced that Blade Runner in 82 wasn't fully color timed to like what Scott would have done if he had, not been basically pushed off. And so it was him fixing a something he felt wrong done by in 82. And I think that is a good impulse, especially because he included all the other versions of the film. And so you now have the 2007 film, Blade Runner: The Final Cut, which is, I think, the best film of them, right? But if that had been the only version released, I would have been very annoyed. Because, but it wasn't, right? We got fully, nicely scanned and presented versions of even the terrible theatrical cut, right? And the director's cut from 92, which again, Scott was not able to directly work on. He was given the opportunity to give notes, right? And he gave those notes, but his hands did not touch it. And so really 2007, the final cut is the only time he personally got to finish that film to his liking. And this wasn't a case of him going back on a decision. No, he wasn't able to make those decisions in the first place. But then he went further and was revisionist with both the sound mix and the color. Now here's the other thing. Unlike a certain special edition of a certain Star Wars type movie, I think that virtually every aesthetic decision Scott made in 2007 was the right one. I think that is a better movie in most ways. I mean, again, one might quibble with some of the storytelling implications of the replicant thing, but that aside, I think on a textural level of color, sound, VFX even, everything was done, I think, really tastefully and really well. Now, again, that is a separate question then. Is this accurate and is this actually preserving the film? Because the answer is no, it's not preserving the film. But alongside that, they are also preserving the film. Now, let's take Star Wars as the flip side of that. You have those two things, right? Is it good? And is it well preserved? And the answer for Star Wars, I think, I'm always right, of course, but I think it's no on both. I think the special edition is a worse movie, and that it is also a travesty of film preservation. And so one can have both those opinions at once. If they had released Blade Runner in only the final cut, it would be a travesty of film preservation, but a really good movie.
Right. Yeah. My sort of go-to, I mean, obviously I don't think anyone needs to have it explained why the special editions of Star Wars being the default and potentially only versions you can legally acquire is bad. But my sort of go-to has always been a film that won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects needs to have those exact visual effects available for viewing. I
know, right? Hey, remember those X-Wings when they weren't computer generated?
Right. And you're talking about Blade Runner. It raises a couple questions. One is, I mean, could we make the argument, and this is now just going fully into theory that has nothing to do with the actual film as it exists. Could we make the argument that because Scott never completed the film to his satisfaction, there was never a finished film called Blade Runner? There were just a bunch of approximate rough cuts of Blade Runner, and that it is in a sense a 2007 film because that is the first time it was released. And then can we say,
I made that exact argument when I introduced the film in a couple years ago at a repertory screening. Basically, you're gonna hear this is a 2007 movie. It uses elements from a movie that was unfinished in 1982, but This is a 2007 film because it was in a series of 80s films, and I kind of wanted to talk about how existentially this is not an 80s film because it's going to sound way better than any other film.
Because my thinking is, let's say someone shoots a bunch of footage and can't do anything with it, and there's certainly a lot of awful B-movie directors that I could specifically point to. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to bring Monster or Go-Go into this conversation. But if a bunch of footage is in a pile and the director never finishes it, the producer never finishes it, and then 15 years later they go back to it with the tools they have 15 years later and they finally make a movie, I don't think any of us would say, no, you must only use 15-year-old tools because there was no film.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other side of the wind thing, right? Where, they scan it digitally, and that's a digital film in the sense that there is no photochemical neg cut they did, right?
Right.
And so that's a 2010s movie, I would say.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think Orson Welles complicates this a lot because so many of his films were basically just a pile of footage or a cut that he'd the first time I ever became aware of a lot of these issues was when Touch of Evil got restored, quote unquote, in the late 90s. And it's it's an amazing feat, and I'm glad it exists. It's not Orson Welles' cut, and it was sold as Orson Welles' cut.
It's interesting too because the original is also not Orson Welles' cut, right? So there's no Orson Welles' cut of that film, and so you kind of either got a bunch of studio hacks hacking away at his work, or really well-meaning people many years later trying to emulate what he might have done, right?
Exactly.
Which is interesting. And I'm glad that almost every release of Touch of Evil that gets released these days has both those versions, because then
the
you
one
can
I
choose.
have actually has, I think, 3 cuts on it.
I got the same one.
The work print, the theatrical release, and the restored cut from 97. But yeah, so it's complicated, I think, is basically true. But I think what is also true is that you and I are both on team, even though we would maybe prefer to watch as a subjective entertainment experience the 2007 Blade Runner, it would be a great pity if the other 2 major cuts were not available next to it. Which I think does get us to the question of what do we do when that is not the case, and when a restoration or preservation, or even just a director going in and saying, no, I've changed my mind, cough, cough, Wong Kar-wai. So let's talk about Wong Kar-wai. Why not? We've hinted around it. Famously, Wong Kar-wai, was it 2 years ago now? I can't remember when
2021, I think,
those restorations. Was it that long? My Lord.
Life is time is a cruel mistress.
Time just keeps on flowing. Had an opportunity. I think Criterion were the first people to release it, but I'm not sure that they funded it. It might have been something that was funded actually in Asia. I don't know. But point being, he had an opportunity to revisit all of his films pretty much, or at least up through the early 2000s. And in some cases, basically just did a nice restoration, did a nice cleanup, and said, yep, that's my movie. But in most cases, futzed. And sometimes the futzing was just, I would like this movie better if it was slightly more teal. And then in the particular case of Fallen Angels, it was basically, I would like this to be a different movie altogether.
I would like this to be a different aspect ratio and skewed, and also the cut's different and the color grading entirely.
Yeah, like no element of that film's visual language was left untouched, I don't think.
The Fallen Angels, I think, was the most destructive by a wide margin.
By a lot.
And I think that's an easy one, right? I don't think it's a gray area at all. I think it's a worse movie now. It's a worse, it's a worse, and it's a worse movie. And I mean, I could go on for ages about how people are compositionally, a lot of people who were defending that cut are compositionally illiterate, but I don't. But I think that my favorite example of like the kind of weirdness of all this is Happy Together, actually, because that's one of the most accurate ones, like the least fussed with ones on the surface. But that's an interesting one because there's kind of no way to accurately present that film, because the footage in that film isn't really transferable in a traditional way, where like they did a cut and then they like would distress the actual elements of the film physically with various chemical and physical processes. Like they were just about stepping on the film stock, right? And then doing weird things to it, even at like the print level. And so different prints of that film are different. Mm-hmm. And so doing that digitally, you're having to like kind of choose and emulate in strange ways. Now, I think they made a lot of bad decisions, like they cut scenes because they weren't in the highest quality negative. So, you know, they cut them because of the quality of the materials. And I'm like, this is Happy Together. This is basically a multi-format film. Like you're doing this to Happy Together. But, so that's an interesting one where I sympathize. And then you got crap like Chungking Express, where he replaced one of the greatest cut to credits ever with like digital word art. Mm-hmm. I just, you know, that did spur me to make my own custom version of Chungking Express, because that's a very easy fan cut to make, but it's quite disastrous. You know,
I'm pleased to say that I had the original Blu-ray of Chunking, so that one was preserved safe for me. I did pick up In the Mood for Love as soon as the set was, because I was planning on getting the set, and then the color came out, and I was like, okay, I'm going to buy In the Mood for Love right now before it goes out of print, because I think that was also a relatively minor set of changes, but the color qualities of that movie, as I have grown up with them through all the versions I've seen, are so particular that I didn't want to see anything that was even modestly different.
In the Mood for Love is an interesting one, because I've never seen a 35 of it, I'm so bad at remembering. I had to look at my logs, but if I've seen it, I don't remember it. And
I saw 35 2.5 decades ago. It doesn't even count.
Exactly. And from what I've been told from people I generally trust, is that the 35 is like somewhere in between the two versions. That the older version of In the Mood for Love seems to be at least a little more white balance, and it was in the print a little warmer, but the new green grade, the consensus is that it's far too green.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get into this. I don't want to quite leave this behind, but it's always green. Like it's never any other color. It always seems like it's always green. But I think this gets into a sort of weird place for me where it's like, if Ridley Scott wants to say this is the proper version of Blade Runner, I mean, we just kind of came up with a theory for why we're willing to accept that. Wong Kar-wai says this is my new version of Chungking. Let's not even touch Fallen Angels. Let's just agree that was him losing his mind. I'm not okay with that. And is it just a simple matter of, well, Ridley Scott has allowed us to see any version. He's preserved all of it. It's all available. It's not like he's repressing cuts. Hi, George Lucas. In some weird way, Chungking Express does feel more destructive to me, though, than something like Blade Runner does. And I can't quite pin my finger on why.
I think it's two things for me. One is that to me, the big thing is just that he has the old versions are out of print. You cannot watch the original cut of that film. And I'm not like, it's not like Star Wars where I think like it's a deep to the fiber of the film thing that infects the whole thing. I think Chungking Express survives a compromise cut to credits, but that's still like my favorite cut to credits this side of a couple other films. But it's up there with Holy Grail. But the thing that really hurts with Chungking Express is, one, it's such a clear, tacky downgrade that just totally walks back like a lot of the aesthetic texture of that moment. And two, it's not available, right? Like that's the original sin of most of this. I think that we wouldn't be having this conversation about a lot of these films if they had just carefully preserved and then made available publicly something resembling the original film, right? Sure. Even if it's 98% there instead of 100, like, I don't mind that, but it's like not 98. And so there's that hubris there where it's like you're denying people the right to see the piece of art that is relevant to the world. And I find that very destructive.
Yeah. The thing that's crossed my mind sometimes over the years, because, obviously George Lucas going apeshit on the Star Wars films has caused so much online discourse. And you'll see sometimes people try to defend it along those lines of like, he's the artist, he could change it. And something that struck me, we go back in time to like a poet will write something from, and like, there's a specific example. I can't think of who it is. One of the major English poets wrote a poem. And then like 20 years later was like, I didn't get it right. Here's the correct version of the poem. And you always in anthologies see those two published like on consecutive pages. So like, I think we need to let artists have room to change. And I think Wong Kar-wai just very obviously is a different filmmaker in the 2020s than he was in the 1990s. He has different priorities. Maybe he's embarrassed of who he was as a younger artist. I think that's true of a lot of these people. I think that's what explains a lot of this. But like, as long as we let them be the artists they are today, and we let Wong Kar-wai make Chungking Express 2021, but then why can't we just put it again in the anthology right next to Chungking Express 1997?
I think it's interesting. I wonder, because when artists deliberately do that, I wonder, most of the time it's economics, right? Like it's very expensive. It's very cheap to print a poem twice. It's not cheap to master two versions of a film. But even then, like, that's a rounding error on how much money Star Wars makes, right? So you do have artists like George Lucas who are just taking that license because of the way cinema is generally presented in a monolithic way. Joni Mitchell did not insist the original version of Both Sides Now be taken down from all streaming services because she re-recorded it in 2000 or whatever, right? Like that wasn't a concern. But yeah, no, it's an interesting dynamic, and I wonder, like, it's something that I personally empathize with in a certain way. A lot of early stuff that I shot, and again, I'm a filmmaker of no repute, a lot of early stuff that I shot, I never got a release. And one set of films I did with one filmmaker finally got released on the Criterion channel. And we took that as an opportunity to kind of like essentially hire our current selves to kind of like basically essentially finish them to a slightly more professional standard in some ways. And so I recolor graded the films from scratch, but in a way that kind of, in my opinion, honored the original vision. But if you look them side by side, yeah, there's differences, like textural differences. And I have mixed feelings about that. If anyone asks, I have the original versions preserved, that if anyone wants them, no one's asked, but they can see them, right? But, so I get that. I'm like, yeah, you've learned a lot in the past 2 decades, and you want to apply that to your cinema for it to be the best version of it, that that corpus of work that lives on forever. But this thing is, a lot of the times, the things that people loved about the original, you're no longer that artist, right? You're not that person anymore. And when you're making fundamental things like, I don't really mind it. Like the new color grade of Chungking Express, for example, is probably no more or less accurate than the old ones in a lot of ways. And certainly the textural representations are. And if Wong Kar-wai wants to make those little adjustments to the palette or whatever within reason, I'm not going to raise a huge fuss. But when you're moving to major aesthetic changes to the film that the original artist would not have been able to make and would not have chosen to make, there's not a fine line, but there's a blurry spectrum that he's kind of on the far end of there.
Yeah, and I think you sort of touched on something there that we should return to. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we're talking right now about like if an artist goes back and changes his mind, like even someone who is trying to destroy his art as thoroughly as George Lucas, he is still George Lucas. He is still the writer director of Star Wars. So he does have a level of like, if anyone gets to play with Star Wars, it's him. We kind of drifted away though from what do we do in the case of preserving films where the artist isn't involved or is dead in a lot of cases. And we talked a little bit about, it is Touch of Evil 97 or 98, whatever year it came out. Is that the Orson Welles film? Well, it's not. And they tried to pretend it was. But other things that are, well, I mean, to go back to Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, like Sergio Leone is dead. The DP, whose name I can't immediately pull.
Tonino Dellicoli.
Thank you. Like you're trying to honor their vision, you and the team that you're working with. But what do we do about these many restorations that I think just sort of say, well, who cares? Let's make something that looks good for TVs playing in a Best Buy in the 2020s, if they even still sell TVs there. And I know we both have some specific things we want to talk about, but one thing I would love to swing back to, we talked about technophile directors, and I think we were talking about a certain Peter Jackson. In my case, I was thinking in terms of like, why ever did he decide that Fellowship of the Ring needed to be emerald green?
So that I have a story with that one. So basically, Lord of the Rings. So I actually think that, long story short, the emerald on Fellowship of the Ring, I think, is a true QC error. I don't think it was intended to be that way, but it weirdly had implications. So I'm going to be really quick on this. Lord of the Rings came at a very interesting time for cinema. Fellowship of the Ring was technically finished photochemically. It didn't have a full DI, digital intermediate. Two Towers, Return of the King did, so they're stuck in like early 2000s DI hell forever. Fellowship of the Ring, though, you can remaster it. And so for the extended Blu-ray, they rescanned it in 4K, I believe. And then obviously there's the 2K digital shots, but a bunch of the film was just rescanned. And then they remastered it. And for whatever reason, on those Blu-rays, the Fellowship of the Ring, the red and the blue channel were lower than the green channel across the board in a very even way, including title cards. And that's, for me, the giveaway. Like, when your opening and ending title cards have a extremely linear specific green shift that is exactly the same as the rest of the film, I'm not thinking artistic license, I'm thinking quality control fuck up.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
And so, but what happened was, weirdly, the later versions, the AI, like we can talk about the UHD versions, which are a disaster and are revisionist and are horrible. They kind of weirdly used that transfer with baked in green as the basis and then washed out the green, but in a very weird way. It's really, I can't account for that part.
No, but I mean, I would certainly, be happy to talk about the disaster of the HDRs of Lord of the Rings. But the thing I was kind of leading up to, Peter Jackson has done his own terrible things to his own legacy, but he sort of has turned into, of late, guy who uses AI to grave rob from the Beatles.
I was hoping you wanted to get to this. It's wild.
I mean, like, I have, this is not a music podcast, so I'm not going to go into my thoughts on what he did with that demo that became the new Beatles single last year.
Oh, God.
But certainly I think right now, maybe the most prominent Peter Jackson project of the last several years was Get Back. And that is not a film I have watched in full, in part. I mean, it's like 70,000 hours long, so that's part of it. I looked at some of the footage and it's like, it made me feel queasy a little bit.
Yeah, and this gets I mean, I actually think you really you nailed this in, I think it was an old Letterboxd entry you had for They Shall Not Grow Old, his previous his like first foray into AI stuff, where I'm going to paraphrase you probably pretty badly, but you said something to the effect of you fundamentally disagree with the idea that because something is old and grainy, it's less than, right? And this gets at my kind of my queasiness. I agree entirely with what you're saying about not just AI per se. Like, it doesn't have to be AI. It can be any set of tools. But this whole idea that because something is old and grainy, we ought to update it. And I think AI is probably the most destructive of these tools, but it's a spectrum. And the reason why I find AI particularly troublesome is, and I've seen this on films I have worked on. It isn't like, I'm not speculating here. I've seen this in action. It's horrible. Where they essentially take low quality, in air quotes, source materials, which usually means bad transfers of stuff that might have been good. And then they ask a computer to fill in the blanks between the data, right? And those blanks can be really big. In fact, those blanks can be more than the data itself. And then you get this like uncanny thing. So in the case of Get Back, you have stuff that was shot on 16 millimeter in Academy ratio, right? And then, well, it's HD. It's TVs are shaped differently. You got to crop in on it, which does a lot of bad things to the compositions in the first place. You're cropping it on 16. Well, it's grainy. And sometimes you're punching in, like he punches in like 200 percentage points. And so you upscale it and then you denoise it because the upscaling still has that noise. And then you add in fake 35 mil grain, which is my favorite part of the whole process, to like give it some texture. And what you get is this kind of thing that I find aesthetically on its face disgusting.
Agreed.
But I think that there's a deeper philosophical problem here, and that's that the historiography of like how this stuff was shot is important. Like the factura, to borrow a Barbara Flukiger phrase, is important. The fact that this was shot on a certain film stock, because that was what it was available at the time, and the physical process of that film stock is history. It's not just a mechanism for showing the Beatles. That film stock is a part of history, and you are erasing that part of history. And I find that the most offensive thing.
No, and I think Get Back makes a lot of things really salient because it is the genre of the film is documentary, right? Like it is, and I'm framing it that way very specifically. We think of documentaries being this other thing. It's reality. Well, no, it's not. It's a way of capturing footage and then editing it together. And we do this using no script, essentially. So it is a documentary, which I think we understand and want to read as, well, this is what's happening. We're standing, we're watching the Beatles, we're recording. And when you tinker with it and you fuss with it, you're taking away that level of, this is no longer a historical record. It has now become this weird sort of digital veil between us and watching the Beatles record their music. But one of the things I always enjoyed blowing my students' mind with when I was still teaching film production, all footage is documentary footage. It's the document of what was happening on a set with actors and a crew, because it's always capturing a reality. I mean, not like animation and things, but it's capturing the reality of what was in front of it. And part of what is interesting to me as a media historian, if I may use a pretentious term like that, is what in 19 whatever year the Let It Be footage was shot, 69, I think, 68,
69, in that range. Yeah.
Like this is where 16 millimeter documentary cameras are becoming a powerhouse for artistic purposes. This is the age of direct cinema. This is the age of cinema verite, the beginnings of television news footage. And like, I think there's something powerful about seeing this like rough footage that just to me feels like you can feel the presence of the camera person. You can feel that like sort of shaky, whatever little handheld Claire camera they're using. And that to me is part of the aesthetic experience. It's part of really just the function of the footage, right? Like it's not just showing me the Beatles, as you say, it's showing me a moment in time that was 1968 with all this 1968ness to it. And I think we're more open to understanding that in the context of a nonfiction film like Get Back. But I think it's equally true if I'm watching, Casablanca. I'm watching a film about a bunch of people in 1942 in costumes on a set, and I want that sort of 1942-ness to be part of that experience. But that's I think why I like talking about these issues in terms of documentary, because there's sort of nowhere to go with it. Like, we're not watching the Beatles in 1968 anymore. We're watching some sort of digital simulacrum of the Beatles.
The ironic thing is I really enjoyed Get Back. But despite all this, I thought it was a fascinating project. But yeah, you see the actual restoration they did of the Let It Be documentary, which this footage originates from, which I don't think is actually a very good piece of trick cinema. I don't think it works.
It's kind of crummy, frankly, but it's interesting.
It's a very boring film.
It is.
And the footage looks so much better when presented in its actual full frame Academy ratio without futzing. I can actually, one kind of maybe somewhat unique perspective I can bring to this is I have been the colorist and post supervisor on, or one or the other, sometimes both, on a bunch of documentaries over the past couple of years. And there's one documentary in particular that I've done enough documentaries that fit this description that I'm not worried about giving anything away. But where I found myself really, really having trouble with how they were using AI to quote unquote restore old footage, where this documentary involved a lot of archival stuff, and a lot of that archival stuff was presented, it was shot on VHS, or not VHS, it was shot on analog video, for television, or otherwise only available in very compromised sources. And when you get that, you have a crossroads, right? You can either embrace that and, maybe throw a lampshade on it to quote the kids, and kind of maybe mat around a TV around it, make it smaller in the frame, right? There's ways you can cue to the audience that, yes, what you're seeing is archival, and that's okay because that is what survives, right? And that's fine. But more and more, filmmakers, especially documentary filmmakers, are seeing that this new tool can restore it, and has magical properties, or so the tech people say, and can bring back data that was lost, right? And so I have, seen in these documentaries, I'll see this horrifically upscale footage with the AI nonsense signs in the background with faces where different eyes have been pasted on. That is a thing I see. Can I just ask real quick, and I don't want to interrupt you, but are you familiar with the I Love Lucy restorations from last year? Yes.
So that's an example. Those of you who don't know, they used AI to restore I Love Lucy for a Blu-ray release, and it went so bad, and it created fake faces on deliberately out of focus characters in the background. The studio actually had to release a replacement disc because one of them was just so unacceptable to watch.
And to me, what I find really worrying about this is that this is becoming the tool of first resort, where now if you have archival footage, it is becoming the norm, not the exception, but the norm. The thing you're expected to do is to AI upscale it. And that I'm really worried that that's actually going to become just a standard in the industry, the same as as using jump cuts in an interview has become the standard, right? Yeah. Because of Errol Morris, which he used it great. No one else has used it great, but he did. Or using recreations, right? Again, Arrow Morse, or using handheld cameras to kind of give some things a sense of authenticity, whether earned or not. None of those things I have inherent problems with, but I have inherent issues with the fact that instead of letting things shot historically or things that have only survived in low quality be low quality, that is now the last resort, is to present them accurately. The first resort is to ask an algorithm to paint between the lines and fake detail where there was none, even if it looked good. And I'm sure in 10 years it'll look better. I still don't think it'll ever look great, but it'll look better. And even in the best case scenario where it looks great, I have huge issues with it, because you are erasing history there, and I find that really sad.
Yeah, I want to latch on to that, but I watched something that you just said that I kind of want to, again, analogizing it to animation. I think it will look better, but it will never look great. And I think part of the reason why is that it is a tool for sort of trying to get to the most, I don't want to say accurate, that's not right at all, but the tool can't make artistic decisions. The tool can just recreate what it believes to be reality, in a sense. Yeah. It looks at what 10,000 cases like this have been, and it tries to average those 10,000 cases into one. And what that makes me think of is rotoscoping, which is the animation technique of filming someone and then tracing directly over them. And that's how most rotoscoping was done at things like the Fleischer Brothers studio. The Disney animators, when they tried using this for Snow White, quickly realized it looked bad because it was too realistic, and animation's not supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to be kind of an exaggeration of reality. So when they were rotoscoping, they would actually like introduce errors just to make it read better as animation. And I think that's what AI is not capable of doing, like artistically understanding where the point to not have it be 100% is. And I think the I Love Lucy is an example of like, it was very clearly, you look at these images, this was an out of focus shot. It was a shallow focus shot that the AI couldn't comprehend. It's supposed to be blurry. So it just de-blurred it, but then de-blurring created a new face.
Well, it's one of those things where quote unquote realism is not a thing. It's an illusion. People think it's a concrete thing, but it's an illusion. No. It's an aesthetic. It's
an aesthetic. Absolutely. I try whenever I write about realism to always make it very clear that I'm describing it as, it's not some fact of the universe we're tapping into. It is a set of aesthetic criteria. And we call that set of aesthetic criteria realism.
And ever evolving,
Yes.
Lighting the Great's Wrath was the height of realism.
For sure. But when you were talking about treating documentary footage, my most recent project was a documentary about a band in the 90s and the band now in the 2020s reflecting on who they were as kids. And we used a lot of footage from the 90s. And we had a conversation. Do we want to prettify up this footage? The director, I was the editor, the director did a couple tests just to see what we could get out of the footage. But even before we realized it looked horrible and we weren't going to use it, I was kind of arguing, look, the pleasure of this film, the theme of this film is people in the 2020s casting their minds back to 1990 and realizing there's this big gulf. Like 35 years ago, I was a different person. That's kind of weird now that I'm thinking about it. And so me, the pleasure really was this contrast between footage that really read as early 90s video footage and then contemporary digital footage, because it's about making past versus present literal in the image. And I won with very little debate, frankly, but it kind of made me feel a little iffy that we had to have the debate, because like why would you want to do this to this footage? I don't know.
And I also wanted this is a good opportunity to kind of draw a distinction here. I last year restored the kind of films of a documentary filmmaker who had recently deceased, local Vancouver filmmaker, and I was given these log scans. And I transformed them so that, they're in the proper color spaces. The point being, they were badly faded, a couple of the films. And so I had a choice, right? I could either run with the fading or use educated guesses to walk back the fading to how the films would likely have looked earlier, right? And that really gets to a question, right? Do you represent the fading, or do you kind of nudge the footage to much more accurately represent how it would have looked when shown? I ended up, walking back the fading when it wasn't otherwise destructive, right? There was still some left in, but when possible, when I knew I could accurately offset the damage that had been done to approximate the look of the original, I did it. And that's the standard for most restoration, right? But there are ethical questions there. I think those are quite far removed from the ethical questions, though, of should I have upscaled the low quality scans, right, of some of these to better do it. And they asked me that. They asked, should we topaz this, which is the most common AI upscaling software? And I immediately went, no, we shouldn't, because that will essentially compromise the integrity of the footage. But everything we do is a compromise, right? I mean, you have, like, for example, myths about the way that scans work that people don't understand. And those are pretty cut and dry, but there's a huge gray area that's really interesting.
Yeah, no. And I want to sort of move towards our conclusion, because I feel like you and I could both talk about this for hours, and I would love to, but unfortunately, we don't want to have a 6-hour podcast episode. But I do want to, well, you and I, what was the episode that we did on your Lubitsch podcast?
Clooney
that was
Brown
so
was
long.
the one where we had to like
Clooney Brown. It was a two-parter.
I don't think we even mentioned. I don't think in the. I think no one's ever really noticed. But yeah, we had like a few weeks. No, it was like a week between the two halves. That was wild. That was great.
Yeah. But I do want to have us maybe speculate, because I certainly can't do more than speculate. These using AI tools. Just trying to futz with old footage to make it more appealing in some capacity. Like what's leading to this, do you think? Why are filmmakers embracing these tools that I think you and I would both say AI does not look good. It's not we don't like it. But obviously people do. I mean, obviously James Cameron got True Lies exactly the way he wanted it to be.
I think that, I think it depends on the person. Like, I get the sense that James Cameron is really enthusiastic about this sort of technology. I just think AI is the wave of the future, so better get on board and try it. The ironic thing for me is that they advertise these transfers as new transfers sometimes, and they are the old transfers. These are old 2K transfers of like aliens, and they have upscaled them with AI instead of just transferring the darn things properly, right? And that's one thing. But I think it's maybe related a bit, but that's a different incentive than, for example, a documentary filmmaker who wants to make old footage look quote unquote better. That filmmaker's incentive, at least in my personal experience, is often, we just don't want people to be distracted by this. We want this to be less noticeable as bad quality. We want the percentage of our film that's bad quality to be as low as possible, right? And that's just something you're trained to do. I mean, that's something you're always told. Shoot in the highest quality, right? Shoot on the highest resolution you can, right? Get the best data, which a lot of those, there's a lot of truth to those, but that, like anything, when it turns into a dogma, regardless of circumstance, you can get led down some pretty unrewarding paths. And then you get, to me, the most troublesome, which is the studios, especially that handle archival stuff. Like, I mean, again, the aforementioned Sony and what Spencer calls their light cannon. And that is mostly marketability, in my opinion. That's like, they know that it's not accurate. They just go, okay, we have HDR. We really want to sell HDR TVs, so we want as much of our content to be as different from SDR as possible.
Sure.
It's again that 5.1 thing. We got 5 channels. Let's use them. Let's put everything on a background. You know, it's one of those things where when something can be marketed and there's money to be made, who cares about accuracy? Market it. Even though I am very skeptical that anyone actually really buys like the Maltese Falcon because it's bright.
Yeah,
you know, that's still the thinking.
I think there's this weird tension. I think Disney really exemplifies it, but I think other studios as well. They want the product to look new, and this is certainly true of a lot of Disney's archival choices about their animated films. They want the movie to look new so that a young audience that doesn't want to watch old things won't be turned off by it. But then, as you say, who are these 20-year-olds who won't watch old movies? They're not picking up the Maltese Falcon, right? Like, so it's not entirely, I mean, I think that's the logic. I think you're exactly correct. Like the studios want to have something they can market more readily and they can make look shiny. And I think a lot of TV technology in particular really does come down to what looks pretty in a big box store. I don't know if that's quite as true for media transfers, but certainly for TV settings.
It's all part of the same interrelated soup. I think that's pretty clear. Exactly.
But like, it does, I think, get to this question of, I mean, why do we have all of these weird futzed with versions of things that are never going to appeal to that? I mean, there are people who just won't watch black and white movies. So why don't we just have black and white movies that don't try to appeal to those mythic consumers?
I think, I mean, it's one of those things where it'll like something like, for example, the HDR brightness thing, you know, you start doing it because studio releases Casablanca first. They release the big stuff first, and we want this bright and impressive. And then that just becomes the norm and becomes normalized. The power of normalization is very, very profound.
That's very, very true.
To me, the real conundrum is, why do ostensibly restoration-focused outfits like Ritrovata and Eclair have such definable house styles? My next transition was going to be, I don't want to let this episode end without bitching about Ritrovata. So yeah, and Eclair, I don't want to let Eclair off the hook.
Obviously. Yeah. I think Ritrovata is like more tangible because it's such a strange house style, because it's basically, I've seen it referred to online as Ritrovata yellow. It's actually more of a yellow green, I think.
It's a split tone. I think what I would call it is a split toning where you have cool shadows, very warm highlights.
Yeah, because I've seen the movie that I think really, I mean, I'd seen it before, but when I was watching the Mattei Affair for the last year, I loved the film. Maybe it was 2 years ago, but it was the new Ritrovata restoration, and there was always a part of my brain being like, I'm watching this incredible piece of political cinema. Boy, is it sure weirdly gold colored in a way that I know is wrong. Yeah. I do find it distracting, so I don't think it's just being like a weirdo who wants everything to be, a certain way.
And it poisons the well, like I find, because people immediately wrote off the 3 colors restorations for that reason, even though they did their homework. Like you can actually see I forget the studio. I feel bad I forgot the studio that did it. It's not Ritrovata, not Eclair. But they did their homework. Like they actually posted even comparisons between the print they had and what they had. I think as far as Ritrovata and Eclair goes, I think I'll give my generous interpretation of it. Previously, one of the norms was you have a negative, you scan it, right? The negative has a certain characteristic look. You flip it, you take it out from log to Rec 709, which is, consumer display standard, with a standard Rec 709 transform. That is inaccurate to how a print looks, right? And you get that very, it's neutral, right? Where prints are not as neutral as that. You see a print like I went to a David Cronenberg retrospective somewhat recently, and and all the prints had that split tone thing where the highlights were warm, the photochemical prints, and oftentimes the digital versions didn't reflect that. So nowadays we have print film emulation that better reflects that. And so I think that Ritrovata and Eclair are probably using very specific formulas for that final step, the print film emulation, to maybe get what they think is either an accurate or aesthetically pleasing kind of representation of that film as presented on a print. I think that something has clearly gone weird in that process, but it feels like maybe they're using an aggressive kind of finishing LUT or preset, whatever you want to call it, to do these films. But there is something happening late in a late stage, I think, that is just biasing all their work in a certain way. And I'm not sure what the reason is. Yeah,
because we say house style, and I mean, people say that. We didn't just invent that on this episode. But obviously it's not that these companies they don't want you to be able to watch a print or a restoration and immediately say, oh, this was done at Eclair. That's not their goal. I can't imagine. It's not like a business that's trying to distinguish itself by having a distinct house style.
And yet,
that's, so it has to be in some capacity an error or a misjudgment. They're not deliberately saying we want our thing to look like this, surely.
Yeah, I also think that I do look at certain Ritrovata grades and I go, this looks terrific. It doesn't look right. I think, for example, the new Ron, I personally, just as a colorist, historical stuff be damned, I think it looks great. I actually love the split tone. I think it complements the costumes nice. I really dig it. If this was a new film and I saw that, I'd be like, this color and the production designer working in concert. I love it.
Ron is another one of those complicated cases for me because I adore the way it looks, but at the same time, I cannot bring myself to believe a Japanese film shot in 1985 is supposed to look like that.
No, it looks futzed with in a way that I think it almost looks like they took the print film emulation and just increase the gain on it by 10 times, because it's the highlights will turn a bit yellow, shadows a bit blue, but it's no, way more than that. But the so again, it's that tension right between the two things: aesthetic judgment, which is a very personal thing, and historical record, which is a much more again, fog of war, etc. But there are objective truths,
right,
to historical record. There is, reality can be arrived at more or less in terms of historical accuracy. Again, ravage the time notwithstanding, and clearly Ron is one and not the other. And I feel like you and I, and we already said this, but I just want to repeat it as a kind of final thought for me, at least. I think we're both on the same page here. The purpose of preservation, I mean, it's to keep the things alive. That's literally what preservation means, right? We have these old film prints that are
turning to vinegar soup. We have these film prints that are just bursting into flames. We want to have them in a form that can be kept safely and permanently, or as permanently as we can manage with these things. But also, I think what we want out of this is to have the experience that someone, like, let's say it's a film from 1938. I want the experience that someone at a top of the line theater watching a newly struck print in 1938 is going to have, right? Like that's kind of, and again, that's a taste issue to a certain extent. Like that, God did not write that on a granite slate. This is how you shall preserve films. But I feel like you and I both would say that's what we believe that's the highest calling of preservation, to recreate the aesthetic experience of 70 years ago.
There's one film actually gives me pause on this, and I don't say this as a counterpoint, but more as I don't know what to make of this.
Sure.
McCabe and Mrs. Miller, my favorite film of the 70s. I saw a release print of it a few years ago, right before the 4K restoration came out. And you know what? The release print was not a fun experience. Okay. The first, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, like it's right on the knife's edge of illegibility, especially the first half, right? Especially with the audio, but it's visual and oral mud. And that's what's beautiful about it, in my opinion. And then I watched the release print and I'm like, oh, this is actual mud. I can't see or hear what's going on. This is actually functionally an avant-garde film for the first half hour, right? An abstract film, I should say. And I know that the ravages of time have had their way with the print, but I would be very, very surprised if that print wasn't also problematically illegible at the time. Okay. And what's happened is, I wonder if in the case of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the fact that starting with the DVD, which was quite a good DVD, every release of it has been clearer to the point when it's still obviously muddy. Like that, it's a famous sound mix for a reason. It's one of the first uses of lavs ever, and the results are very messy, and I think it contributes to the film. Mm-hmm. But I only ever saw it in that version. What if I had only ever saw it on a film print with that mud? And again, the digital versions are as accurate as you can kind of get a digital version without just like making it muddy intentionally, right? And so the very nature of a digital presentation changes how I interact with that film.
Interesting.
Especially because they could it isn't really cleaned up. It's just presented with more fidelity, because you can do that when you're not striking a film print with like the quality control standards of the early 70s, right? Which were like very messy. Mm-hmm. And so, messy compared to the digital era. They were very well refined in many other ways, but that gives me pause. I'm like, okay, so is the way forward with McCabe and Mrs. Miller to make it as messy and poorly quality controlled as the print I saw? Or do you kind of do what they did and kind of, use the fact that it's digital to present it with the clarity that was in the original elements, the negative and the magnetic soundtrack? Like how much do you replicate a bad exhibition, basically?
Sure.
Which this film was kind of lent itself to. So I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's definitely, this is the reason why it's an art, not a science, right? It's because there are these sort of interpretive questions. I think what we do know is that we don't want to have AI demodify McCabe and Mrs. Miller, if nothing else.
Can you imagine? Like, I got Topaz on my workstation. I can make an 8K version of that with just totally grainless, and I could fix the contrast issues that Vilmos Zsigmond's darn pre-flashing did. I can make it look great. Well, let's do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably about all I have to say on the topic, or at least all I'm going to say on the topic in the course of this episode. Do you have any points you really want to make sure we get to before?
We got to everything I did, and I want to thank you for bearing with. I'm in a very ranty mood today, I think. And thank you with your patience with my extreme exuberance on this subject.
Oh, no, I care about this a lot. I did not mention this at the start because it just kind of, we glided by it. But if I could ask the genie for any job in film, the job would be color grading. So, because when I learned how to use DaVinci Resolve for the first time, I was like, oh, this is it. This is my baby. And I've never done it professionally ever, but I still enjoy it a lot.
It's fun. It's fun when the clients are nice.
Yes. As is true of every professional project one will get involved with. Well, thank you so much, Devan, for joining. I had a great time chatting. Love to hear your thoughts on all of these issues. Before we go, do you have any projects you'd like to plug? Any place we can find you online?
Yeah, I'm currently I've promised my students I'm going to make a video essay here, so I can say that I'm occasionally posting video essays to my YouTube channel. Like I mentioned the log one earlier. I think it's the most recent one. It was almost a year ago, so not that recent. But if you want to hear me rant about color science, I'm on there. I'm on Letterboxd. You should follow. If you don't follow Tim on Letterboxd, what are you doing here? Follow him first. He's much better at it. But I think I'm okay at it. And so
I enjoy your Letterboxd posts very much. They are bulleted in a way that's very easy to follow your thought process, and they're always super techy in a way that I really enjoy.
Yeah, if you want to hear me rant about restoration and tech stuff, I'm on Letterboxd. I also had Tim was our most consistent guest on our complete Lubitsch retrospective podcast called How Would Lubitsch Do It that finished last year. If you haven't listened to that, listen to Tim's episodes. He's a terrific guest and a terrific host. And so, much more arcana on that. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of around doing a lot of color grading. I'm currently teaching at a castle. And so my career is a chaotic swirl of many different things. So, who can say what I do or what I can plug, but I'm here and I'm so happy to be here with you, Tim. It's always an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's so great to chat with you. So thank you very much. That's going to do it for this episode. We will be back to our normal schedule next Tuesday with another episode of Mandy Albert and Your Movie Rocks. In the meantime, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. If you enjoy the show, think about giving us some support through Patreon. It's right there on the show notes and on the sidebar. Otherwise, we'll catch you soon.